My name is Clara, and I'm 46 years old. Life, for the most part, hasn't turned out the way I imagined. 2 years ago, my husband, Victor, passed away. He was a quiet man, kind in his way, but distant. He spent most of his time lost in his thoughts or absorbed in work. After he was gone, I resigned myself to a simple life, gardening in the mornings, attending family gatherings when necessary, and reading by the fireplace in the evenings. It was peaceful, predictable, and maybe just a little too quiet. That summer, everything changed. Isaac, Victor's nephew, came to visit. He was 34, and his presence was like a storm rolling into my serene but stagnant life. Isaac had just finished a grueling project in the city and wanted to escape the constant hum of urban chaos. His plan was to stay for a few weeks to recharge, to soak in the calm countryside. When he first arrived, he carried an air of restlessness, a crackling energy that seemed at odds with the sleepy town and its slow rhythms. At first, he kept to himself, walking along forest trails or sitting on the porch with a book in hand. I found him peculiar, but intriguing. He reminded me of Victor when we first met, but there was something different about Isaac, something I couldn't quite place. One morning, I was in the garden wrestling with a stubborn old fence that had seen better days. It was hot, the kind of summer heat that sticks to your skin and makes even small tasks feel monumental. Isaac appeared from nowhere, his shirt casually slung over one shoulder, a hammer in his hand. "Need help?" he asked, his tone light, but his green eyes serious. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "If you don't mind." He got to work without another word, his movements deliberate and unhurried. As he hammered and tightened, I noticed the contrast between him and Victor. Where Victor had always been distracted, almost absent, Isaac was present in every movement, every glance. He worked with purpose, and it was strangely comforting to watch. After the fence was finally secured, we sat on the porch with glasses of lemonade. The conversation started awkwardly, but soon flowed easily, as if we'd known each other forever. We talked about his years in the city, my life here, and everything in between. He had a way of listening that made me feel seen. Not the kind of polite, half-hearted listening I'd grown used to, but the kind that made me feel like my words mattered. It had been so long since I'd felt that. In the evenings, Isaac would join me on the porch, and we'd sit in comfortable silence or chat about nothing in particular. One night, under a sky speckled with stars, he asked, "Do you ever think about what's next?" I blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "Life," he said simply. "What do you want it to look like now?" I didn't know how to answer. I'd spent so much time living day by day that I hadn't thought about the future. I told him as much, and he nodded as if he understood. "Maybe it's time to start thinking about it," he said softly. There was something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just talking about me, but about himself too. I felt a flicker of something I couldn't name, a spark that had been absent for far too long. As the days turned into weeks, Isaac became more than just a visitor. He became part of the house, the garden, the rhythm of my days. And though neither of us said it out loud, there was an unspoken connection growing between us, something fragile and unexpected. One afternoon, I decided to tackle the attic. It had been years since I'd ventured up there, too many memories, too much dust. Isaac insisted on helping, and I didn't have the energy to argue. As we sifted through boxes of old photographs and forgotten trinkets, I caught him staring at a picture of me in my 20s. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice almost reverent. I laughed awkwardly, brushing it off. That was a long time ago. "Doesn't matter," he replied, his gaze steady. "You still are." The words hung in the air, heavier than they should have been. For a moment, the attic seemed smaller, the space between us charged with something unspoken. I looked away, pretending to be absorbed in the contents of an old box, but my heart was racing. Later that night, I sat alone on the porch, a cup of tea in my hands. The horizon glowed faintly as the sun dipped out of sight. My thoughts kept circling back to Isaac, his words, his presence, the way he made me feel like maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than what I'd settled for. And for the first time in years, I wondered if it was true. Isaac had been with me for nearly 3 weeks, and the days had taken on a rhythm I hadn't expected. He'd wake early, slipping out for a jog or a walk through the woods, returning with a lightness that seemed to brighten the entire house. I'd make breakfast, and we'd sit at the small kitchen table, the morning sunlight streaming through the windows as we talked about everything from city life to the quirks of small-town living. One morning, as I poured him another cup of coffee, he asked, "Why haven't you ever left this place?" The question caught me off guard. I hesitated, then shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I never felt the need. This is home." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "But don't you ever wonder what else is out there?" I smiled faintly. Not everyone needs to go searching for something new. Sometimes, it's enough to just be. "And are you," he asked softly, "just being?" The question lingered long after he'd gone out for his usual mid-morning walk. I found myself mulling over his words, questioning things I hadn't dared to before. Was I content? Or had I just grown comfortable in my solitude, mistaking it for peace? That afternoon, we tackled another long-neglected project, repainting the shutters on the front of the house. The task was mundane, but Isaac approached it with his characteristic focus, and I found myself enjoying the simplicity of it. At one point, as I stood on a ladder, trying to reach the top of a shutter, I felt his hands steadying the base. His touch was firm, reassuring, and for a brief moment, I was acutely aware of how close he was. "Careful up there," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. I glanced down at him, smiling. "You think I'm going to fall?" "I think you like to take risks when you're not looking," he replied, his gaze meeting mine. There was something in his tone, something that made my heart skip a beat. I laughed lightly, brushing it off, but the moment stayed with me long after we'd finished the shutters and cleaned up for the day. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, I asked him about his life in the city. He talked about the long hours, the endless meetings, the sense of disconnection that had driven him to seek solace here. "It's like you're always moving, but you're never getting anywhere," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Is that why you came here?" I asked. He nodded. "I needed to breathe, to figure out what's next." "And have you?" He turned to me, his green eyes searching mine. "Maybe. I think so." The weight of his gaze was almost too much, and I looked away, focusing on the horizon. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, filled with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. As the days went on, our conversations grew deeper. He told me about his childhood, his dreams, and the things he feared most. In return, I shared stories I hadn't spoken aloud in years. There was an ease between us, a sense of trust that felt rare and precious. But with that trust came something else, something neither of us dared to name. It was in the way his hand would linger on mine when he passed me a dish, in the way our laughter would trail off into quiet moments that felt charged with possibility. It was in the way I found myself looking for excuses to spend time with him, to hear his voice, to feel his presence. And it was in the way he looked at me, as if he saw me not as the woman I had been or the widow I had become, but as someone I could be. The rain finally stopped the next morning, leaving the world refreshed and glistening. The air smelled of damp earth and renewal, and the sunlight broke through the clouds, casting golden beams across the garden. For the first time in weeks, I felt an unusual lightness as I stepped outside, the grass soft and cool beneath my feet. Isaac was already in the garden, crouched near the vegetable patch with a pair of gloves and a trowel, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Morning," he said, glancing up and offering a small smile. Figured I'd get a head start before the sun gets too hot. I nodded, suddenly self-conscious. The events of the previous evening still lingered between us, unspoken but palpable. "It looks good out here," I said, gesturing to the tidy rows of plants he'd been working on. "You've done a lot." He shrugged, brushing dirt from his hands. "It's easy to lose track of time when you're doing something with your hands. Feels grounding." I leaned against the fence, watching him work. There was a quiet strength in his movements, an ease that made me wonder what he was thinking. "Thank you," I said suddenly, surprising myself. He paused, looking at me with a question in his eyes. "For what?" "For being here," I said softly. "For helping. For everything." His expression softened, and for a moment, the air between us seemed to shift. "I should be the one thanking you," he said. "I came here to escape, to figure things out, and instead, I've found," he trailed off, his gaze dropping to the ground. "Found what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He met my eyes then, his green gaze steady and unflinching. "Something worth staying for." The words hung between us, fragile and profound. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, he stood and brushed off his gloves. "Come on," he said, his tone lighter. "There's a fence on the east side that could use some attention. Want to give me a hand?" Grateful for the shift, I nodded and followed him, grabbing the spare set of gloves he offered. Together, we worked in companionable silence, the occasional exchange of words punctuated by the sound of tools and the songs of birds. As the hours passed, I felt something settle inside me, a quiet sense of belonging I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Later, as we sat on the porch sharing a pitcher of iced tea, I found myself asking, "Do you think it's really possible to start over?" He looked at me, his expression thoughtful. "I think starting over doesn't mean forgetting what came before. It just means choosing to keep going, even when it's hard." His words stayed with me long after the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the hum of the cicadas, I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years: hope. For the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could hold something beautiful again. The next few days passed in a blur of small but meaningful moments. Isaac and I fell into an easy routine, our lives intertwining in ways that felt natural and unforced. Whether we were repairing fences, weeding the garden, or sharing quiet meals on the porch, there was an unspoken understanding between us that grew with each passing day. One afternoon, while sorting through a pile of old tools in the shed, I found an old, weathered notebook. Its pages were filled with Victor's handwriting, plans for the garden, sketches of ideas he'd never had the chance to complete. I showed it to Isaac, who studied it with a quiet reverence. "He had good ideas," Isaac said, tracing a finger over one of the sketches. "We could finish some of these, if you'd like." The suggestion caught me off guard, but as I looked at the notebook and then at Isaac, I felt a warmth spread through me. "I'd like that," I said. Together, we began bringing Victor's plans to life. It felt like a way to honor the past while moving forward, each completed project a step toward something new. Isaac's presence made it easier to let go of the weight I'd been carrying, his steady support giving me the courage to face the uncertainty of what lay ahead. One evening, as we stood by the garden watching the fireflies flicker in the twilight, Isaac turned to me, his expression serious. "Clara, can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, my heart quickening at his tone. "What do you want?" he asked, his green eyes searching mine. "Not just here, not just now, but in your life. What do you really want?" The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. But as I stood there, the scent of flowers in the air and the warmth of Isaac's presence beside me, the answer began to take shape. I want to feel alive again, I said quietly. I want to feel like there's more to life than just getting through the days. I want to find happiness. Or at least something close to it. Isaac nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. I think you're closer to that than you realize. As the night deepened and the stars filled the sky, I found myself believing him. The past would always be a part of me, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to define me. And as I looked at Isaac, I felt a spark of something new, a sense that the future, for the first time in a long time, was full of possibilities. The days turned cooler as summer began to slip into autumn, but the warmth between Isaac and me only grew. The garden, once a quiet retreat, now felt like a place of transformation, a sanctuary where life moved forward one small change at a time. Together, we had revived Victor's plans, brought new blooms to neglected corners, and repaired the worn-out paths that had once seemed too much to tackle alone. One crisp afternoon, Isaac suggested we take a drive to the lake, a place I hadn't visited in years. The idea both thrilled and unnerved me. The lake had been a special spot for Victor and me, a place we'd go to escape the routines of daily life. But it had also been abandoned in the years after his death, its memories too sharp, too vivid to confront. Are you sure? I asked as Isaac loaded the truck with a basket of sandwiches and a thermos of tea. It's been a long time since I've been there. He paused, his hands resting on the tailgate as he looked at me. I think it's time to make new memories, he said simply. The drive was quiet, the kind of silence that felt more like understanding than awkwardness. I watched the countryside roll by, the fields giving way to dense woods that eventually opened to the wide expanse of the lake. When we arrived, the water shimmered under the pale autumn sun, the trees along the shore ablaze with reds and golds. It was beautiful, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a place haunted by the past. We spread a blanket near the edge of the water, the air crisp but not cold. As we ate, Isaac shared stories from his childhood, moments of laughter and mischief that painted a picture of a life I'd never known. In turn, I told him about my early days with Victor, the hopes and dreams we'd shared before life had grown complicated. You really loved him, Isaac said, his voice quiet but certain. I did, I replied, looking out over the water. But love changes, doesn't it? It becomes quieter, steadier. And sometimes, you don't realize how much you've drifted apart until you look back. He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. It's strange how we hold on to things, even when they're no longer what we need. Or maybe it's that we're afraid to admit we've changed. The truth in his words settled between us, heavy but not unwelcome. I reached for the thermos and poured us each a cup of tea, the warmth seeping through the ceramic mug into my hands. As we sipped, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, his plans for the future, my favorite books, the best way to bake an apple pie. The easy rhythm of our exchange felt like a balm, soothing the lingering ache of old wounds. Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Isaac suggested a walk along the shore. The trail was uneven, scattered with pebbles and fallen leaves, but he offered his hand to steady me. I hesitated for a moment before taking it, the simple gesture sending a ripple of warmth through me. Clara, he said as we walked, his voice breaking the soft murmur of the wind. I've been thinking a lot about what's next for me, about what I want. And, I asked, glancing at him. He stopped, turning to face me. And I think I've found a reason to stay. My breath caught, the meaning behind his words clear and unmistakable. The air between us seemed to hum with unspoken possibilities, the lake and the woods and the fading sunlight all fading into the background. Isaac, I began, unsure of what to say. But he didn't let me finish. I know it's complicated, he said, his voice steady but laced with vulnerability. And I know there's a lot to figure out. But being here with you, it feels right. Like I finally found something I didn't know I was looking for. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I looked at him, the sincerity in his gaze undoing me. For so long, I'd told myself that love, real, consuming, life-changing love, was something that only happened once. But in that moment, I began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was possible to find it again. I don't have all the answers, I said finally, my voice trembling. But I know that being with you has made me feel alive. And I don't want to let that go. A slow smile spread across his face, and he reached up to brush a tear from my cheek. Then we'll figure it out together, he said simply. As we stood there, the lake stretching out behind us and the sky painted in hues of orange and pink, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The journey ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time, it didn't feel so daunting. With Isaac by my side, it felt like anything was possible. The days grew shorter as autumn deepened, the golden hues of summer giving way to the rich amber and crimson of fall. The air turned crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Life around the house felt different now. Isaac's presence, once a temporary reprieve, had become integral, shaping the rhythm of my days in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each moment seemed to hold a quiet significance, a kind word shared over morning coffee, the brush of his hand as we passed in the kitchen, or the laughter that echoed through the garden during our shared tasks. But beneath the surface, the question of what next loomed ever larger, demanding answers neither of us had fully articulated. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in fiery tones, Isaac and I worked side by side stacking firewood for the coming winter. The physical labor was grounding, a welcome distraction from the swirling thoughts that occupied my mind. But even in the simplicity of the task, the tension between us was palpable, like a string pulled taut and waiting to snap. "We're going to need more wood than this," Isaac said, breaking the silence as he set another log on the pile. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a weight that hinted at something unspoken. I nodded, wiping my hands on my jeans. "There's plenty in the shed. We'll get to it tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he echoed, almost to himself. He paused, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Clara, I need to talk to you." The seriousness in his tone made me still. I turned to face him, my pulse quickening. "What is it?" He set the last log down and straightened, brushing the dirt from his hands. "It's about us," he said simply. The words hung in the cool autumn air, heavy and undeniable. I felt my breath catch, my heart pounding in my chest. For weeks, we had danced around this moment, avoiding it out of fear or uncertainty. But now, there was no escaping it. "Go on," I said softly, bracing myself for whatever he was about to say. Isaac took a deep breath, his green eyes searching mine. "I don't know what the future looks like," he began. "But what I do know is that being here with you feels like the most real thing I've ever experienced. I came here to escape, to find clarity, and instead, I found you. I can't imagine leaving and pretending this didn't happen, Clara. But I also know this isn't simple." My throat tightened as I listened, emotions swirling within me. "Isaac," I began, but he held up a hand, stopping me. "Let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now. I just needed you to know where I stand. Whatever this is, whatever it could become, I'm willing to figure it out. But only if you are." His honesty left me speechless. For so long, I'd convinced myself that my life was set, that my story had already been written. But Isaac had come into my world like a breath of fresh air, challenging those beliefs and awakening something I thought I'd lost forever. "I don't have all the answers either," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I know that you've made me feel alive again. And that scares me as much as it excites me." A small smile tugged at his lips. I'll take that as a good sign. I couldn't help but laugh, the tension breaking like the first rays of sunlight after a storm. For the first time in weeks, the uncertainty didn't feel so heavy. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something fragile, yes, but full of possibility. Over the next few weeks, we settled into a new rhythm, one marked by quiet moments of connection and the steady unfolding of something deeper. We didn't try to label what was happening between us. Instead, we let it grow naturally, like the changing seasons that shaped the world around us. But even as we moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on borrowed time, that the delicate balance we'd found could be upended at any moment. That moment came on a chilly November evening. We were in the living room, a fire crackling in the hearth as we shared a bottle of wine. The conversation had drifted to lighter topics, childhood memories, embarrassing moments, and favorite books, when Isaac's phone buzzed on the coffee table. He glanced at it, his expression shifting as he read the message. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He hesitated before nodding.
"Yeah.
It's just my boss. They're asking if I'm planning to come back soon." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, though I tried not to show it. Of course, this moment was inevitable. Isaac's life in the city hadn't disappeared just because he'd come here. Still, the thought of him leaving left an ache I couldn't ignore. "And are you?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. Isaac set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't know," he admitted. "A part of me feels like I should, but another part of me doesn't want to." I nodded, looking down at my hands. "It's your decision," I said, though the words felt hollow. "I'd understand if you needed to go." "Would you?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I'd try. Because I care about you, Isaac. And I want what's best for you, even if it's not here." The honesty in my own words surprised me, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Isaac reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "What if what's best for me is here? With you?" Tears blurred my vision as I squeezed his hand. "Then I'd be very lucky." As winter approached, the decisions that loomed over us became impossible to ignore. Isaac had commitments in the city, a career he'd worked hard to build. I had my life here, a life that had been shaped by loss but was slowly finding new meaning. Reconciling these two worlds felt daunting, but together, we faced the uncertainty with open hearts and a shared determination to make it work. On the first snow of the season, Isaac and I stood on the porch, watching the flakes fall silently around us. The world seemed hushed, as if holding its breath. He slipped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. "No matter where this takes us," he said, his voice low but steady, "I want you to know that I'm all in. For as long as you'll have me." I leaned into him, the warmth of his embrace chasing away the chill. "For as long as you want to stay," I replied, my heart full. In that moment, surrounded by the quiet beauty of the snow and the promise of what lay ahead, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but it was one we were ready to walk together, step by step, season by season, come what may.